All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip. This is the fourth week of Advent, and David Congdon is here, and we are gonna Bultmann. We're gonna Bultmann, and if for some reason you're saying to yourself, "Whoa, I love this David Congdon fella. I'm interested in the Bultmann, and I want to hear the lecture that apparently he gave that I haven't heard," then you should go to ohgodwhatnow.net. godwhatnow.net, and you can join. It's donation based, including zero. So if you're just mildly interested in what David said, which is probably going to be better than what he's going to say once I start pestering him with holiday cheer, then go over there. Thank you. Look, the fact that over 100 people are joining live this close to Christmas with kids out, rather impressive. Those of you listening on the podcast later or watching the video, we're not judging you. I understand. And you could have made the choice to just start drinking wine right when you get on the live stream. So, yeah, David, thank you for being here. And when I told my family, I said, "Hey, I'm going downstairs. I got to spend some time with David and Rudolph." My daughter was like, "Really?" I was like, "No, Bultmann, Rudolf Bultmann."
And yet people who misspell his name as the reindeer, that's an ongoing joke among my friends. You always get the PH, Rudolph.
I was like, Rudolph is similar to Bultmann in that his origin story also begins in a situation of deep angst and conflict with the world in which he found himself. He's in the North Pole, and the world of the North Pole has a normative notion of what it means to be a reindeer, and yet his red nose does not quite fit. And in fact, this expectations of normativity in the North Pole is such that there's a whole collection of Iceland creatures that don't fit. And Rudolph becomes the recognition of that the other that you define yourself against could actually be the place that salvation happens. I mean, possibly a salvation that means little kitties get cool stuff dropped off, but you know, just saying.
I mean, there's a lot of parallels here. I just recently watched that movie for the first time in like 20 years, and I was struck by some interesting fodder for commentary for sure.
Yeah. The class politics of Rudolph is
Yep.
also enjoyable. All right.
Yep.
Okay, so before we dig in, one of the things that showed up in a number of questions is both people's what did you say, second and third hand awareness of Rudolf Bultmann and the things they'd heard about him. We even had one person say these sermons were way too Christian to really be Rudolf Bultmann's sermons. And I know that you came up in a more evangelical context, and so a number of people were interested into how you discovered him, how you found him, and then that he became a theologian that you've spent so much time with, despite some of the hyperbolic PR.
I mean, one of the books that I had early on started the draft and started to outline was a book on Bultmann the Evangelical. Precisely because, yes, I mean, he is very Christian, very even pietist, I guess you could say. I mean, his family was pietist. So, I mean, a little bit about my own exposure to him. I didn't really encounter him directly until I was really in my PhD program. I had read a lot of theologians who were in the circles of his influence, of course, Barth, Bonhoeffer, others who were sort of in that, that world. But it was really, so I really wanted to study Eberhard Jungel. So Jungel is this German theologian who's sort of a third generation Bultmannian. He was a student of Bultmann's student, Ernst Fuchs. And reading Jungel's work, I was enraptured by his theology. I thought it was really profound. Bultmann appears all over the place in his work, and I remember one day coming to some professors and friends of mine, just saying, like, I'm really interested in Jungel, but then I'm curious about this Bultmann guy. I don't know if, for those of you who remember the blogosphere, the theological blogosphere, there was a friend of mine, Ben Myers, who had a big blog, Faith and Theology, for many years. And he had written an article in 2008, Bultmann's Understanding of Faith. I brought that to my professor and Bruce McCormick at Princeton Seminary, and he said, "That's your topic for your dissertation, Bultmann." And so I did grow up evangelical. I grew up in that world, and I think one of the things that was really surprising to me, I deconstructed very early before it was a word, before that was cool, and in many ways, I came to seminary to get away from evangelicalism. But what I found in my studies there, and specifically of Bultmann, was a theologian and a theology that allowed me to take the best of evangelicalism and retain it, and make it make sense and workable within a more intellectually, satisfying frame of mind, and theology. So, Bultmann, ironically, given his reputation as like this arch heretic, arch liberal, really helped me to recover some of my evangelicalism.
Mhm. No. Okay, so can we just have a completely separate podcast on Jungel? I'm big Jungel fan. Um, God, the Mystery of the World is in my if I got tagged
Yep.
and had to do the 20 books and
Hmm.
20-day things, that would be one of them.
Yep.
I think it is like just peak theological brilliance,
Yep.
and
It
very
changed
few
my life.
people have
Yep.
read it. And so I just feel like we should just talk about it, and we can invite any of the people are mutual friends. We can just talk about it. I think that book is so good, and
Yep.
people should listen to it or read it. Um, and anyway, uh, I had a Jungel student, Ingolf Dalfert, was on my
No,
committee,
sure. Oh yeah,
and so
absolutely.
the one of my favorite classes was the hermeneutical theology class that started with Bultmann, and then goes through
Yep.
all those friends. So one of the things that showed up in a number of questions in your lecture, you use the phrase world picture
Yep.
versus worldview, which has its worldview as its own baggage in contemporary religious context. But maybe you can say a bit about how Bultmann wanted to think through world pictures and how that kind of orients what he means by demythologizing, be it the biblical text or any particular age.
Yeah, this language it's sort of archaic and confusing, and I use the language of world picture largely to, well, one, to correct the translations. So if you read a lot of English translations of Bultmann's work, they often just use worldview, and that elides the distinction between worldview and world picture that Bultmann uses throughout his writings in the German. Um, and it's confusing because there's a distinction there that's important. So a world picture, this is a term from Wilhelm Dilthey, a 19th century philosopher of religion and theologian. And the term essentially is referring to uh, this the kind of pre-conscious or just largely kind of cultural assumptions about the world that we just have. When we're born into a world that we just understand it operates under certain rules, and under certain there are certain features of the world that just form our mental picture of the cosmos. Things like there are stars that are gaseous balls way out there, trillions of light years away, or there are, gravity operates a certain way. These kind of operational assumptions about the world. Um, Now, and part of what the term is doing is trying to catalog the way that those assumed pictures of the cosmos have changed over time. It used to be, if you read it like in ancient texts, those planets and stars are angelic beings, deities out, in the heavenly, spaces, the celestial realm. That, of course, is not our world picture, or at least for most people. Doesn't That's not the operational picture of the world that we have today, and so our world picture is different. Um, it's different from a worldview in the sense that, at least for the Germans understand worldview to be a more of a chosen theory about the cosmos, right? So, you and I might have this understanding of the sun being the center of our solar system, right? But we may not a person may not have a theory understands gravity and the movement of celestial bodies and all that stuff, right? The actual theory behind that picture. So a worldview is it takes the world picture and kind of systematizes it into a theoretical understanding of the world, of ourselves, God, whatever it might be. Um, so what Bultmann's trying to do in his theory and understanding of demythologizing is to say different people over time have had different world pictures. And this is just a human phenomenon. This is part of what it means to change and develop over time. History, culture changes. And the task of theology is to kind of translate the message of the text, the message of the gospel, into one's own world picture. This all assumes, and this is a basic assumption for Bultmann, that the gospel is world picture neutral. It doesn't come with an assumption about what one's picture of the world ought to be. If you see the world as being angelic hosts out there in the stars and the planets, so be it, right? That's the world picture of that time. Within our modern post Copernicus, post Galileo, post Newton kind of world picture, we have a different conception. And for Bultmann, that's also perfectly okay. And then the task is to figure out how do we translate into that context.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think is helpful about this is even kind of the, I don't know, more naive way worldview discussions play out in a lot of Christian education, right? Where there is a Christian worldview. And there's certain things that are kind of like obviously problematic about it, which both Bultmann and Bonhoeffer, who was reading Dilthey, this is when Dilthey's the philosopher who uses the phrase "the world come of age," right?
Exactly.
So
right.
there was a time you were like, oh, well, that's convenient. The rain goddess saw my dance, and now the stuff, and now you're like, well, I talked to a meteorologist, and one narrative of this kind of one that somehow correlates to colonialist expansion is one where there is a worldview that is ultimately normative and right, and someone possesses it and now imposes it on the others, right? And so there is this kind of like hyper modern, secular, reductive worldview, or that's usually funded by a naive picture of science and the economic system. And then there's a battle of this other worldview, the Christian one, because it obviously is the real true one that can tell you what all this is going on. And what happens when you think of worldviews is that then someone, say with a strong religious or anti-religious worldview, sees the world as a place where humans are accountable to higher power or to reason or to the market or something where now the whole world is being inscribed from some normative sovereign subject. And then, oh, well, now we're going to have a whole battle, right? Because to tell the place from here is to tell the truth is to occupy the space of the singular story. And what's fascinating to me in something that when you talk about seeing Bultmann as like this other way of being evangelical or Protestant, he just goes, well, what? Well, how wimpy would the gospel be if for some reason the God giving God's self to the world, the inbreaking of divine life in finite world, what if it only really made sense if, and then insert a worldview, it only made sense if you were born into a place where you were a persecuted white evangelical but run the Supreme Court, House and Senate and presidency. It only makes sense if you were in Second Temple period Judaism. It only makes sense if you were a culturally conservative German after World War I and hate the licentiousness of the Weimar Republic. Like there are all these places that I think worldview logic is so intimately connected to the supremacist power and domination systems that theological critique of idolatry that's been throughout all this series, you see him uniquely kind of lifting up that worldviews are tools of empire.
100%. I mean, one of the things that and this might be anticipating where we're going to go, but in the debates over demythologizing, when Bultmann came under heresy trials over this program, um, the one of the central lines of critique of Bultmann in that period, and this is in the late 40s, early 50s, was that was this idea that when God came into Earth in the incarnation, God came to dwell specifically in that period so that God could take up the Greco-Roman ideas of anthropology, cosmos, deity, all the rest at that time. That God could only have become incarnate at that moment because that was the time in which the correct philosophical concepts were in play to make incarnation possible. This was the argument by the conservative Lutherans who were attacking Bultmann's you know, qualifications for orthodoxy, because Bultmann was saying absolutely not. That's fundamentally incorrect. That it would not have mattered when God chose to enter into and break into the world. It's in principle irrelevant. Any period of time, any moment in time, any period in history is capable of bearing that message, and that we have to incorporate that possibility into our theology.
Mhm, mhm. So, there are a couple questions about this that around the virgin birth, and I thought, as someone who's familiar both with Bultmann and Karl Barth, who take very different kind of, well, I guess over time they got more divergent.
Sure. Yeah.
But could you kind of talk about, kind of compare and contrast the two about how Bultmann's kind of, well, he's a New Testament scholar primarily, but how his relationship to the New Testament oriented him differently to the question of the virgin birth or virgin conception than someone like Karl Barth, and how that question played out differently in their thought.
Yeah, I mean, so Bultmann is coming to these texts from a historical critical perspective. He just assumes that as these orienting framework for thinking about these things. So he was trained as a form critic. So form criticism was this theory of biblical scholarship that uh, understood the forms, the kind of stylistic forms of the text, especially the Gospels, as being as a window into the cultural and historical situation of the authors. So, what the form critics did was they would break down the text into specific pericope, these small passages that had a specific style to them. Maybe they were, a introduction to a letter. Maybe they were a parable. Some other kind of form, and then they would try to distill, understand what's the historical context of that kind of text. Now, that style of criticism has certainly gone out of favor, but what that training did for Bultmann was that it attuned him to look beyond the words on the page, to think about what's the rhetorical, political, social impact of this text. What's the work that it's doing rhetorically for a community in that period in time and place. And so a text like the virgin birth, he's looking at this historically and saying, okay, clearly Paul doesn't have access to this story. It wasn't part of his thinking about Jesus. And it made sense for it to be a later addition to this tradition because it functions just, rhetorically to help bolster the claim of Jesus's divinity post resurrection. So it's a post Easter addition to these texts. So all of the kind of historical context that is going into this work of reading the text in that historical way, that's part of how Bultmann is reading those kinds of passages.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that might be helpful here is to describe then what he does with it, right? Because there
Sure.
is that temptation of, oh, well, that's not history, it's myth. Let me set it aside, right?
Right.
And which in some sense privileges just our time as much as, say, some kind of conservative supernaturalist is going to say, oh, well, then when Jesus said that there were demons, they're literal
Mhm.
demons. Or in the 4th century, when they said that we needed to invent a cool philosophical category to explain the incarnation, then that was correct, or whatnot. So when you here's one of the ways the question got put. Anthony asked, so after you demythologize, what is one making a decision for? And he mentioned a couple in the sermons, there are a couple times you emphasize this notion of decision. So
Right.
take us into that, the how that existential demand or the kind of hermeneutical horizon for Bultmann?
Sure. I want to just step back for one moment and say there isn't really an after to demythologizing. This is one of the things I try to impress in my books is that demythologizing doesn't stop. In other words, it's not a process that you do it and then you on the other end of it you get this new text or this new version of the text and then you work with that. Demythologizing is the process by which we try to proclaim this text in a new way today, right? And so that's always happening, always anew. Um, Now, so that's going to mean that whatever I say about, or whatever Bultmann says about the virgin birth or some other passage, is never a fixed thing. It's never a final interpretation. So, having said that, as a caveat,
Can I
part,
ask one
yeah,
thing about that?
sure,
And um, one of the things I discovered, and you can tell me if this is right, when I got to spend a lot more time with Bultmann, is that you're not getting to some object, right? Where, oh, well, now I've demythologized and I've gotten to the real object we can get to.
mhm, right,
Because faith or the event or decision is not about finally getting to the proper object. Like, it just happens to have less content to it than Aquinas or something. That that the that you're getting to a different orientation, and so the process of demythologizing is connected to that. Even in one of the sermons, right? Blessed are those who don't take offense at me, um, because it should be offensive, not
mhm,
because it's backwards. And you're like, you want me to believe that he floated up into heaven and is probably just now leaving the Milky Way if he went the speed of light? It's not some like object that you like possess and now defend. It's a whole orientation of one's life, subjectivity, and such. And I think that's anyway. I found that helpful to hearing what
yeah.
he's getting at.
Yeah, I mean, one if you look at the original demythologizing essay, his essay on New Testament mythology, one of the things he explicitly criticizes is this notion that demythologizing involves picking and choosing which passages are normative, right? So what Bultmann is not doing is to say, let's get rid of the myth and leave behind the kernel, the element of that's true and eternal. Rather, he's saying, let's read the whole text is mythical, right? The whole text is shaped by a world picture that's foreign to us. Let's read that whole text and translate the whole thing, right? And that means that even the passages that strike us as bizarre or strange have a critical role to play in communicating the message. And so, whether that's a virgin birth or whether that's a demonic exorcism or whatever it might be, all these texts have their place in bearing witness to this truth, this reality, this message that is the task of the interpreter. Now, um, so there's no final kernel or object that we're trying to get to. Um, Bultmann, having said that, Bultmann doesn't say a whole lot about the virgin birth. It's not a topic that he dwells much on. He does certainly dwell on incarnation. Incarnation is a crucial, maybe even the central theme of his theological writings throughout. So, I mean, Advent and Christmas is sort of the heart of his theology. John 1:14, the word became flesh. Like that is the central verse of his entire career, arguably. And it comes up all the time. And so incarnation, in whatever guise it comes in, is crucial for Bultmann. And it gets back to this question earlier you mentioned about the decision. So part of how Bultmann reads incarnation and reads Christmas, reads these texts, is to say, God is invading the world and confronting humanity with a decision. Are you going to live in the way of the light, in the way of the truth, the way of love, or are you not? That's ultimately the fundamental decision that each person is faced with. There are certainly different ways that decision comes to us. Um, it's ultimately the decision of faith in various ways.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and how would you kind of compare, this is one of the other questions, what Bultmann's doing in thinking about myth and history and that kind of dynamic with say the notion of saga in Karl Barth?
Yeah, so Karl Barth wants to kind of situate himself somewhere between Bultmann on one side and, for lack of a better word, the kind of the literalists on the other side, the biblicists. So Barth wants to recognize that these ancient texts are shaped by ideas of the world that are foreign, that we don't want, that we no longer share, um, and uh, but but Barth wants to say that there is some some kernel of history that's going on in there, that there's a historical element in an unhistorical garb, I suppose. It's a little complicated. I mean, Bart's own way of fleshing this out is a little complicated and not always coherent in my view. I kind of take Bart to task a little bit in my own work because I think he's trying to have it both ways. But saga is this term, kind of like legend, kind of, it's another term that sort of operates in this nebulous gray space between myth and, scientific fact, something like that. um it's complicated in part also because it sort of misrepresents Bultmann, because Bultmann isn't sort of pitting myth against fact or myth against truth. That's not what Bultmann is doing. In fact, one of Bultmann's writings that I translated for the first time in my first book, is all about the truth of myth. That myth it bears a truth in it, a deep truth. It's not simply falsehood that we have to get rid of. Rather, it is an existentially true text, and so we need to read it as such.
Hmm.
The challenge for Bart and for Boltmann is this ongoing battle of what counts as history. What is history? Um, and if somebody like Bart wants to say that the resurrection is historical, but also not historical, right? The resurrection is something that is true history, but it's not something that, for Bart at least, the resurrection was not observable history. It's not something that a journalist or a scientist could have analyzed. But that begs the question, like, what exactly is it then? Right? So, one of the things that Bultmann challenged Barth over regarding the resurrection, this is also true of evangelicals like Carl Henry, who interviewed Barth. They all kind of question, like, what do you mean by this, Barth? You're not making a lot of sense. You want to say that it's not something that we could have observed, we could have tested, but it's also not something that's not, but it's still historical. Like, so Bart's fuzzy on this. In part, that's because he likes to operate in this space of what's best for the church's preaching, and the church's work. Uh, Bultmann really wants to do something different. Bultmann wants to say, let's be as fully critical and fully, scientific and historically responsible as we can, and then with that knowledge, let's translate our message in terms that can be responsible to the historical work and speak to the church.
Hmm.
How do we do that?
Yeah. Okay. So, um, one other question before going to the different passages from the sermons people picked out, and you can also tell us your favorite parts too. But I kind of marked ones that at least two people mentioned,
Mhm.
sections two people mentioned.
Sure.
Is uh, what was the question? What was kind of the context for Boltmann when it goes to historical Jesus and Jesus's own vision of the kingdom of God, Jesus' own kind of apocalyptic eschatology, all that kind of question. What was that context? How did he relate to it? And what, like, how did that end up shaping the way he thought about it theologically? Which I think in all three of these sermons, you see what happens when someone who is right. I'm not going to deny or repress what we're learning over here, but I'm also not going to pretend
Mhm.
like we learned something in our age that somehow mutes or lessens or diminishes the call of the gospel. Right? And he has these kind of like two tracks. Um, but when you think of New Testament studies and such at that time, um, what was the debate around Jesus eschatology?
Yep.
Um, and Gene wants to know the theologian we talked about, Eberhard Jungel. Eberhard Jungel, God, the Mystery of the World, is one of the greatest theological texts of the 20th century. And
It's, yeah,
yeah,
Ju with an umlaut,
yeah.
and GEL. Yeah. Um, The context is really complicated in this period because if we there are different stages of the historical Jesus quest. So the first quest for the historical Jesus uh, kind of came to an end right before Bultmann developed as a theologian. So there was this late 19th century, early 20th century quest for Jesus that was somewhat historically naive. They were trying to find these lives of Jesus were being written all over the place. These attempts to kind of do a biography of Jesus that was their effort to be historical. And some of you might know Albert Schweitzer's famous book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, that demolished that first quest, really savaged those theologians for being, doing shoddy work. And Bultmann, so Schweitzer did that book at the same time, around the same time. Johannes Weiss, which I mentioned in the lecture, he wrote his book on the proclamation of Jesus, on about the kingdom of God. And that book also was very critical of the liberal theologians for really creating this false view about what Jesus was talking about. He wasn't talking about this commonwealth of brotherhood and society. He was talking about a literal kingdom of God coming down, entering the earth from the beyond, and um, so Weiss and Schweitzer did this in the 1890s, early 1900s. And that was more or less the consensus by the time that Bultmann came into his educational process about a decade after Schweitzer wrote his book, or just a handful of years, really. Um, and so that's the assumption. So the historical Jesus, in many ways, when Bultmann was a student, had come to a close. This inaugurated a period of what is often falsely called the no quest period. It's not a no quest period. There were certainly other historical inquiries going on. But what Barth and Bultmann and those in that school were trying to do was to say, okay, the quest for the historical Jesus is a failure. It's not going to work. It's only going to produce a Jesus that looks like us. Okay, so let's not do that. Instead, let's take what we can glean from our historical research, and then let's, again, like the word translate, let's find a way to make that message meaningful for today. We're not going to recover the original Jesus through our research. We're not going to find out once and for all what Jesus actually said. But what we can do is present Jesus in a way that's meaningful for today. So that's what they did theologically, was they tried to say, let's take his eschatology, let's take the eschatological vision that Jesus had, and then let's try to rework that in a way that makes sense for today. So that was their way of doing justice to the historical Jesus without trying to, once and for all figure out exactly what the Jesus of history looked like.
Yeah. Okay, so throughout these three different Advent sermons that we looked at,
Mhm.
uh, Bultmann is kind of like pastorally ingenious at using the text to talk about the present without browbeating everyone.
Yep.
And there were a couple clergy that asked about different parts. So I wonder if you want to start by just talking about, as someone who spent a lot of time with Bultmann, how someone who's both a New Testament scholar, involved in kind of existentialist philosophy at the time, and such, how did all of his and was an early critic of the rise of the Nazi movement and such. How
Right.
did all of that show up in his sermons? Like, if how do you imagine Bultmann to articulate that deeply, I mean, a sacramental task for Lutherans
Mhm.
of the proclamation, and the hermeneutical theology tradition in general prizes it. So how would you kind of, what would he look at a preacher sitting there at Advent, or maybe thinking of their Christmas Eve sermon, and go, let me tell you about your job?
Well, I mean, he did that very strongly. In fact, actually, one of the very first things he did when he joined the faculty at the University of Marburg was to essentially launch a campaign to allow the theologians on the faculty to take control of the worship service at the university. So it used to be that the university had their like on staff chaplains there who did all the preaching, and Bultmann wasn't going to have any of that because he didn't like how they were doing their job. Basically, the sermons that they were preaching were these kind of really watered down liberal sermons that were just kind of like, uh, you know, didn't really challenge anything. Didn't really do any rhetorical work to really make the gospel meaningful and really a word of scandal to the listener. Um, and so Bultmann, it took quite a few years, but eventually got them to agree, got the university to agree to let the university be independent of the church district, the kind of the parish of that region. So they weren't under any oversight from the church. They could control their sermons and they could preach what they wanted to preach, and the theological faculty were in charge of it. And that was Bultmann's goal. And he finally succeeded in doing that right as the Nazis rose into power. And so it's the political overtones that we see in these sermons is not accidental. He was very clearly and consciously trying to create a space at the University of Marburg Chapel where the theologians could present their response to the crises of their day without being overseen by the government. That's effectively what they did. So um, Bultmann was strategic about this. He had a mission in mind to achieve that. So I mean, what we see in these sermons is this really interesting creative mix of historical sensitivity, theological kind of reflection, and political implications. Those are all working simultaneously throughout these texts. These are operating actually throughout all of his work. Really, if you read if you read his commentaries, if you read his theological essays, they're all doing all of that all the time. One of the things that I talk about in my work is the Gospel of John commentary, where there's a long section on where Jesus confronts Pilate, which is all, if you read it, it's one long allegory for the way that the Christians are confronting Hitler. Um, and so it's all veiled, and of course in New Testament speak and commentary discourse, but he's doing that political rhetorical work all the time, and we see that in these sermons very clearly.
Oh yeah. I mean, the best example, um, uh, to me was the second one, which is December 39. So this is months after World War II started.
Hmm.
There's been this giant buildup. Eventually, Hitler's like, "Oh, we're going to rearm," and things start going. So this is a time Hitler's so successful that the German Christian movement is gaining traction. These are the like the make Germany great again cheerleaders are
Yeah.
gaining traction. The moderates are getting more quiet, and everyone's like, "Well, obviously God's on his side. Look how great Germany's doing." And he uses how can we celebrate Christmas because of the soldiers? And I got a couple emails about this. Like, was he endorsing the war? Blah blah blah. I was like, go back and read it, and you tell me: is he being a nationalist about soldiers, or is he talking to a whole bunch of people who people went to serve in the army because they knew Nazis started killing anyone that resisted military service,
Hmm. Right.
right? And there's like, you couldn't say he's not being a good German in scare quotes, but he's talking about people struggling with whether or not they should do military service. And the question of the peace and joy of the season, like if you're stuck doing this and you think about your family at home, the moment you raise the historical question, and this is something you see in the life of Bonhoeffer as well, of wanting to avoid military service, and then his students, even at Finkenwalde, end up serving, and is they hold they'll kill your family if you start messing around. The moment you put in that context, the exchange with one of the students is like, oh, that's what's going on, and it's kind of just beautiful. I don't know about you, David, but I know a lot of brilliant New Testament scholars, and the percentage of them that could preach this good is,
No, yeah, it's true.
yeah.
He was a great preacher. I mean, yeah, you could tell. I mean, he was adept at uh, finding a way to his audience. Um, No, one thing I didn't, this is not included, of course, in this, but his early sermons. So he preached Advent sermons for Bultmann go back to the very beginning. His first Advent sermon was in 1907, right? So it goes back quite a ways. But some of his early Advent sermons in the period of the Great War, the First World War, in the very start of the war, he preaches a sermon about this, and there we see a very different message because at that point he hadn't yet kind of come to his convictions about the state, about politics, about theology, about any of those dialectical themes that we talk about now. So at that point, he was very much a good German theologian, right? And there he talks about the fatherland and the importance of the importance of the soldiers going out there and doing uh, doing God's work, right? So you compare that to these sermons here, and you have a very different message. The turning point for Bultmann came in 1916, 1917, when he actually he visited a hospital camp for soldiers who were injured. His one of his friends was killed. So there were a lot of things that kind of woke him up about that. But yes, by this point here in the late 30s, early 40s, we're seeing him very carefully addressing these themes in a way that will not get him immediately arrested, but also present his hearers with a very clear message about what they need to prioritize in their life.
Mm-hmm. So, in the first sermon, which is looking at John's disciples coming to Jesus after John the Baptist is in prison, and is like, "Hey, are you the one we're looking for?" And Jesus is like, "Why don't you tell John what I've been up to? Um, take I'm dominating some blindness, giving them sight, casting out some demons and junk, and telling good news to the poor." In and then he ends and says, "And blessed are those is he who takes no offense at me." And this being an Advent text, becomes for Bultmann an occasion to look at both the question that John the Baptist is, being sent, like, "Are you the one? Like, are you the one we're hoping for?" And then, right there in the Bible, David, this is shocking. Jesus passes up on real biblical Christianity. I don't know if you noticed this. Jesus could have said, "Well, you ask John, does he have Isaiah around? Because if he just rolls to chapter 53, he can, he doesn't give any Bible verses to explain how he's really the messianic hope that's happening right in the present. He talks about the very events that are taking place, and really gives a sideways answer. Um, and and one of the things that happens in this text, and my favorite way it showed up in a question, Sarah said, uh, "I can tell Bultmann read this passage and said, 'Oh, this isn't what my conservative friends would have thought Jesus was going to do if he wanted to be really clear. So let
Mhm.
me make some really cool philosophical points. I just think I only got half of them.'" So, on a sermon that takes
Yeah.
this text, and
Mhm.
then Bultmann sees it and goes, "I just want some biblical Christianity right now in 1938." Uh, what? How does he see that text, and then what does he do with it?
Well, yeah, this is one of those things that I always love about Bultmann. He's able to find these texts that really unsettle their hearers, the readers, and it's a window into a whole different way of thinking about theology, about Christianity. In this case here, one of the things that Bultmann really latches onto is this idea that Jesus doesn't give some proof, doesn't give some evidence. This is no Josh McDowell. Here's a list of all the things that I've done to prove that I am the one. Um, in many ways, what he's doing here, from Boltmann's perspective, Jesus is undermining, the pursuit of proof, um, and it's it one of the, so what Boltmann does in this passage, and this is in the sermon here. He says Jesus doesn't give a direct answer. He says neither yes nor no, um, and these one of the questions he's raising here is these these miracles, these things happen when Christ is present and around, but those things didn't convince everyone. Not everyone saw those things and thought, okay, this is he who was promised. This is the messianic hope realized. Not at all. So the miraculous deeds that he's listing off here, there's actually a veiled challenge within them. You know, you have to be one who is ready to hear them and see them for this other truth, this other reality. It's not self-evident. It's not there on the surface. So this text becomes, in many ways, a quintessentially dialectical text for Bultmann. That is, the things on the surface, the things that we see, that are visible, that are tangible, um, they constitute a decision, a challenge for us. Um, do we see them for what they really are, right? Which is a deeper truth than simply a list of great deeds, right? The great deed on its own doesn't convince somebody. It's the spiritual conviction and challenge, the faith. That's the crucial hinge here. So Bultmann sees this text as kind of giving us a window into that dialectical truth, which runs throughout all these New Testament passages and texts. Um, are we prepared to be those who will follow and follow this way, follow this path, respond accordingly? Um, we're not going to follow just by seeing a list of great deeds or having a lot of proof thrown at us. Just because we have some historical evidence about some archaeological dig, it's not going to magically make us, disciples of Christ, right? That's always the kind of this fallacy of the evangelical pursuit of evidence and proof, as if that's all that's holding us back. It's not. There's the existential challenge. That's the real challenge of faith. Are we prepared to abandon our old way of viewing ourselves, our old way of living, and follow a different path? That's the real challenge, and that's something that no catalog of proof can ever give us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so through this sermon, there's a few passages where you see him picking up a lot of those themes and the theological vision that you developed in your essay. Early on 101, he says, men today are to a large extent satisfied with the world, and that insofar as they are not, they live in the belief that it lies in their own hands to give the world the form which they consider right, and that this high aim they're prepared to sacrifice their time and strength, in fact, also their property and blood, right? And this is, you can just hear Dilthey's world come of age. Like, why do we even need God? We're in charge of the solution, even if we don't figure out. He then goes on to lift up kind of the rather shallow Marxist critique of religion, and then it does something which there's a number of passages in some of his academic places where he talks about where that kind of demythologizing energy gets turned to modernity as well.
Mhm.
But this passage sounded very much like Jacques Ellul. And there we had a questioner ask about this, where he says, this hope only faded with the period. And he's talking about the messianic style hope, that the horizon contains something beyond the world we already know, rather than in modernity that the world we know, we're like, we just need to fine tune it. We just need to
Mhm.
get people to think reasonably. We just need more time and data. Um, this hope only faded when with the period when man began to suppose that by knowledge and technical science he could wholly subjugate the world to his own dominion. We are now living in this age, and indeed we are at its climax, since we not only understand how to organize and exploit the powers of nature by technical mastery, but also suppose that we can control the life of man by means of ingeniously contrived and subtly elaborated technique designed to ensure complete dominance over the minds of men. Thus, it is hoped to establish an empire of success. Now, okay, this is, in the last year and a half, I basically read everything of Bonhoeffer and like a million books by it and put together an audio documentary. I just want you to know, and when you go reading the German Christian movement's sermons,
Mhm.
legitimating Hitler,
Mhm.
uh, 3 of their 6 big principles are lambasted in this passage without, like, I mean, it's pretty close to quoting.
Yep.
So like he then wants to say first, just like the Frankfurt School later, the Nazis, death camps, Auschwitz, and the nukes are modernity. It's modernity revealed. It's not the exception, right? We are the climax. He's talking about Hitler about to rearm, take junk over. Second, he's like, this is how we see the world. We want to organize it, exploit it, control it. This is where they're debating around eugenics. They're debating around killing people with special needs. These kinds of things are taking place. It's all sitting there going on. And he's just like, you want to know who doesn't even know how to ask the question that you have to ask correctly to hear the gospel? Modern people. Ones that think our world that we're creating is a solution, that we've organized the world and exploited the world. We understand it and can control it. Thank you, science and technology. And he does all of this. He's just like laying it all out and then goes, and thus modernity wants to hope that establish the empire success, which is one of the substitutes for the new 1,000-year Reich, is an empire of success. So, like, I know a few people I wouldn't have known if I hadn't spent way too much time in this time period recently, but just that one paragraph is a challenge to modernity, right? At that point. There's also an allusion to the power of propaganda, right? Ensure complete dominance over minds. And I mean, Hitler was a pioneer of new technology for propaganda. I'm interested in the kind of critique of modernity as kind of plugging our ears from ever being able to hear the gospel. So many features of his one moment are labeled there, and the equivalent would be like making sarcastic comments about algorithms, Doge, efficiency. Like, if everyone would pick it up if we did a version for our own version of modernity. But I wonder how do you understand for hermeneutical theology, like dialing up modernity is a problem to 11?
Okay, so I mean that was good. I think where I would want to qualify that assessment or that reading of Bultmann is to say he's not criticizing modernity per se in itself, and this is an important point.
Or technique.
Yeah, well, yes. Although I think one of the things I think he's actually trying to get at here in this sermon, and I think this is true too. This function, this characteristic of humanity's attempt to pursue mastery, is universal throughout all time. In fact, he's tracing it back to ancient Greco-Roman period, right? The ancient Greeks and Romans were doing the same thing. They were pursuing mastery. They had an empire of success. They were trying to dominate their world, right? And so it's not uniquely modern. This is a uniquely human problem, to want to control the world, to find technical mastery, to dominate others, to find success, and to do that at the expense of others. That. So it's I think it's really important not to read this as uniquely modern, because one of the things that Bultmann is doing very very carefully here throughout, and not just in the sermon, but I mean in his writings generally, is to say you can be a spiritually and intellectually fulfilled modern Christian.
Mm-hmm.
That is completely possible, and in fact necessary for us to pursue what that might look like. Modernity itself is faith neutral in that sense. That is in the same way that you could be a medieval Christian, you can be an ancient Christian, you can be some beyond modernity. We can also be Christian in that sense too. Every time in history is a potential place for us to encounter the message of the gospel, to encounter Advent, to encounter this inbreaking reality, and to be transformed by it. That is perennially true. So it's not modernity that's a problem. It's humanity. It's the world that's a problem. World in this kind of theologically laden Johannine sense of the term.
Yeah, and in that on the next page there, okay, so he does draw a connection between, right, like what's happening in the present and just domination systems in general.
Sure.
But in this sermon and the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitude sermon, that he does give large numbers of examples of how in a world come of age, the problem of hubris,
Mhm.
of self-legitimacy, self-efficiency, self-legitimation is unique in some sense, or takes a particular form. Because like on the next page, he does something that is where he says Christians realize that whenever any system is established in this world, however noble, lofty it seems,
Mhm.
it is only possible through sheer power. And in the process of setting up any secular order, whether nationally or internationally, you just, everyone knows exactly who he's talking to, but it
Yep.
has to include everyone to be clear. It's not personal, Adolf. Human beings, when this happens, human beings are sacrificed and crushed,
Yep.
right? Like that sense that here's what idols do: they
Correct.
demand sacrifice. Um, is there? So, okay, there was one other big question about this that showed up. Three different people asked, and it's in section 2, page 107. They reference these two different parts. I'll just read them both.
Mhm.
This is where he's reflecting on, "Blessed is he who takes no offense at me. It is therefore clear that if Jesus is the one who is to come, he is not so in the plain unequivocal way which longings and hopes, desires, and fancies picture. He is not so in the sense which man imagined that he must be. As to whether he is the one who is to come, the burden of decision rests on us." And then towards the end of the thing, he says, in thinking about what this decision looks like, because it's not just the deeds that legitimate it. Where Christ holds sway, miraculous things happen, but the miraculous is not proof in any sense acceptable to the world. It is only an imitation which invites decision. And then he says, we must be careful not to ask for proofs which might relieve us of the burden of decision.
Right.
When you think of that offense and decision, and in the way in which the miraculous normally gets used, how does faith and miracle and enactment reoriented here?
Yeah. I mean, this gets back to what I was saying earlier about what the sermon is trying to do, and I think um, w- w- Boltmann is he reads this passage, and I would say it's fair to say he reads the New Testament more in general from the perspective of this theological conviction that um, fundamentally Revelation encounters us as a disruptive challenge. That's what Revelation is. Not simply a just a disclosure of a list of facts about God, doctrines to believe, just the thing that we can just intellectually check off. Doom, doom, we've done all these things. It's not a list of actions we have to perform that we've now demonstrated our moral superiority. If it's not a challenge, it's not revelation. It's not faith, right? And so one of the things he's consistently critical of is this effort to domesticate revelation, to make God, to make Christ something that is easy, easily adapted to, adopted, assumed, taken control of. So, when we encounter a passage like this, what he's trying to warn against is this temptation on the part of apologists to turn this into here's Jesus giving a list of here's Jesus giving us his CV, his resume of great deeds that prove he is the Messiah. Um, Bultmann is reading this text against that grain to say no, that would really undermine the challenge that we see all the way throughout the Gospels. Jesus is constantly a challenge and really a scandal, an offense to people wherever he goes. So it can't be that he's just giving people an easy list of proof and that's done. We've done and dusted that issue, right? No. So what's really going on here? And that's where Bultmann's trying to reach a deeper message that's beyond simply what the text presents us.
Mm-hmm. And so when he gets around to saying, and he says a version of this in essentially all three sermons,
Mhm.
something like that. if you sit here and are sitting here at Advent and going, we're praying like, "Come, Lord Jesus," and you're the questions that pop up in your mind, it's like, well, what did it mean for him to come the first time? Did he really come? And if he came the first time and that's already happened, then like, why is he going to come again? And what is it, the point of coming again? And it's like the kinds of questions that both uh, a kind of pre-hermeneutical liberal Christian that's just, you know, obsessed with history, or people that are like have a kind of naive allegiance to literalism debate. He kind of like looks at both of them and go, man, the New Testament doesn't even understand your question.
Right.
Like, it's not a biblical one, it's a modern one, and y'all see history odd. And so he has a number of these statements that imply a hermeneutical shift. I want to read one of them and then you kind of just talk about
Sure.
it.
Mhm.
He says, just because through his coming, our outlook on the world and on time is completely changed. The event of his coming is not an event within the process of world history, an event such as a straightaway merged with the past. It is rather an event which signifies the end of the process of world history. And then he says, faith then gives to the Christian this unshakable certitude. And it is characteristic situation of Christians that so long as they remain on earth, they must walk by faith, not by sight. Right. And that not by sight thing is connected to the
Yes.
event not being a thing that happens in history.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is a really important passage. This is repeated in his work verbatim multiple times, right, throughout his writings. This is in many ways the central theme of Bultmann's entire dialectical theology. This is what it's about. When he talks about eschatology, this is what he means. Eschatology for Bultmann is uh, is this is a message not about what's going to happen in the future, but rather it's a transcendent reality. So eschatology, we're often accustomed to think of eschatology as this linear line, past, present, future, and that kind of like linear trajectory. Bultmann thinks of eschatology in a vertical line, uh, the imminent world of the earth and the transcendent world of the beyond. And so what he's saying here is that uh, the the events, the realities of God operate at a remove from the imminent plane of world history, of earthly history. It's they are truthfully transcendent history, eschatological realities. And so what that means is that they are invisible to the eyes to the eyes of the world. They're visible only to the eyes of faith. So faith alone can perceive these events in their truth. Now, that's not to deny that there are real world historical, you know, occurrences that Bultmann is referring to. Jesus is a person in world history, but Jesus as the Christ, as the Messiah, as the inbreaking of revelation, that is not accessible to historical perspective, to the eyes of the world. It's only visible to the eyes of faith, to those who live by faith, not by sight.
Mm-hmm. And so kind of pick up that in the second sermon, he's using light and darkness imagery, right? Which is which whatever any particular situation is, you'll see more or less based on how much light there is. So like the dynamic of light is not temporally dependent.
Right.
It's about the presence or not so much of the light. So like, how does he take that hermeneutical vision and then pick up the light imagery in John, which if people are seized by this, is I am one of the best books, if you like preaching out of John, is his John commentary. Like Bultmann's commentary on John
Yep.
is one of like, even when I think he's wrong, it's preaches, that's how
Yeah.
good his commentary on John is. But anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it's these images, these metaphors are all functioning synonymously with each other in various ways. You can have eschatology and history. You have light and dark. You can have transcendence and immanence, divine and human. These are all these binaries are used by Bultmann to convey uh, this broader truth. And so Bultmann finds these throughout the New Testament, and in some ways synthesizes them or sees them across texts in order to help us see this consistent theme that keeps popping up over and over and over again. This challenge that is presented to us. Um, are we going to live it this way? Are we going to embrace this new reality? Are we going to respond to this confrontation, to this challenge, or not? So
Mhm.
Light Darkness does that very well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and the one of the passages that both he and Tillich and Bonhoeffer all dwell on, like if you were like, what did they write the most about from the John prologue?
Mhm.
That phrase, like he came to his own and they knew him not.
Right.
Right. I'm not as familiar with Barth, so it could be true for him as well. You know, I have to be assigned him or have a friend tell me to read it to do Karl Barth. It's a prejudice. It's true. Um, but one of the things why I say that is because throughout this whole series, we've noticed how if you asked all three of them, like, tell me about faith, it's an event. Tell me about what matters, that God shows up. Where does God show up from? Well, we didn't birth it. That's why you need the Theotokos. Like all of them has this incarnational emphasis, this event image, all these kinds of things, and like returning to that, like seizing that in a radical way allows them to go like, well, if the Logos showed up and you were literally rolling deep with Jesus and still got it wrong, I wonder if the church might be doing the same thing in the present. That the word of God could be in front of you, and then you're like, no, make Germany great again. You know, so that light darkness thing that they all in a sense go, the part of the waiting and part of the event of the incarnation is like treasuring the fact that the Christian tradition gives us permission to be both really wrong, idolatry making scumbags that blow junk up, and are in a community that goes, let's remind ourselves every week this is what we do. And in the midst of all this, that's where we find the presence of God. And so let us make a decision to do what? Tend to it. And in all three of his sermons, and in all the sermons we've read, all of them have this move to discipleship as tending to the presence of God, showing up in the dark, embodied places of their own time.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I want to go back to that whole world process thing about this miraculous nature of the incarnation, because there is a very important political message here that you just kind of help bring out there, which is that Bultmann is very much speaking to the German nationalists of his time, the German Christian nationalists of his time, who are thoroughly wrapped up in this idea that the Nazi, the Nazi Germany is the kingdom of God realized, that they can bring about this divine kingdom on earth. And part of why Bultmann is so emphatic about the eschatological, transcendent, non-worldly character of God's revelation in God's kingdom is precisely to challenge those German Christians and the German nationalists, and really to say your priorities are entirely misplaced. You have the wrong. You're locating truth, you're locating revelation, you're locating our hope in the wrong location, and let's throw that out, because that's not where it is, and recognize the actual hope, the actual truth that is beyond what anything that we can do in our nation, in our communities. It will have an impact on us, it'll transform us, but it's not going to be in the way you want it to be.
Yeah. Okay, so there's one more passage. 4 different people brought it up. So, and they asked very different questions. So I'm just going to read it and you say whatever you want.
Okay.
And then there was one question that's tangentially related, but they were like, could you please ask David this at the end because it might be provocative. All right. So this is page 209. If you're looking at the PDF, he says, we human beings are all of us expectant. The difference between us is, however, whether we picture the future in fantasies born of our desires and dreams, or whether our waiting for the future is so radical that we renounce all such dreams and yet are cheerful in our confident waiting? Do we step forward with confident trust into a future which is shrouded in darkness for us because our hope is set on God's future, which surpasses all that we can desire or conceive? To be Christian means to be one who waits for God's future. Hence, for the Christian, perhaps all seasons are essentially an Advent season. For Advent is characterized above all by this note of expectation. Yes, it is so. And yet, it seems good to distinguish a season of Advent in the round of the church's year as a special time of expectation. It is intended to remind us sharply of what we so easily and so often forget, namely that, as Christians, we are expectant.
I mean, it's one of my favorite passages in all of Bultmann. I think it's. I mean, I chose these sermons with this sermon in particular in mind as like the climax in many ways of what is crucial to his thought. Um, I mean, Bultmann is a theologian of hope before Moltmann was, and that is, I think, clear throughout all of his writings. He is an eschatological theologian. He thinks in terms of the future. God is the God of the future for Bultmann, and this is a theme that comes out in his essays, his commentary, everywhere else. Um, the the Christian life for Bultmann is one, uh, yeah, as he says, of being expectant, which is not. It's careful to kind of delineate this and distinguish it from a sort of, we might say, a fundamentalist evangelical kind of approach that, we're looking forward to this actual occurrence in future world history, right? That a kind of chronological conception of the future. This event will take place at some point in time. Bultmann is not operating at that level when he talks about the future. For him, the future is really God. It's really this the horizon of possibility that draws us out of ourselves, out of our comfort, out of our security, and into a position and a posture of being open to uh, discomfort, uh, insecurity, and new possibilities. One of the lines, one of Bultmann's most favorite lines from Luther is this line that where Luther, and I don't remember the exact wording, but basically Luther says that in faith we go out into utter darkness. Okay, Bultmann loved this because uh, for Bultmann this captures something true about faith, which is that it doesn't give us a clear roadmap for where to go, what to do. The Bible doesn't hand us a blueprint for life. When Jesus says "love your neighbor," that we don't know what that exactly is going to mean. We don't know what it will mean to love our neighbor because we have to encounter that neighbor for ourselves in that moment and find out what they need. And only then will we be able to discern this is what it means to love this person. And that's something that's true for Bultmann everywhere. That to be a person of faith means to be ready for the unknown and to go into that unknown, into that darkness, expectant and hopeful.
Yeah. All right. Here's your last question. This is from Jennifer. She said she enjoyed our conversation on the podcast and went and listened to the old ones and then watch your lecture. There are a number of times you and David giggle after he makes an NT Wright joke. Apparently she found some tweeting about you trolling NT Wright. And she wants to know what goes through NT Wright's head when he reads Bultmann, because whatever it is, I don't pick up because I like some of his things and I really liked Bultmann's sermons and don't see what the big deal is.
Ooh, this is spicy.
Now, see, the funny thing is, you're less offended by this question than Tom might be. Like
Oh, sure.
that some of his stuff is exciting, but it reminded Jennifer of these Bultmann sermons she just read.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that would be very offensive to him for sure. I mean, I mean, it's complicated because Bultmann, of course, is himself a very complicated person. There's more than just his sermons. I think if all we had were his sermons, he'd be fairly universally loved among many people, because you don't really get a lot of some of the more scandalous stuff that you see in some of his other work. Um, I do think that uh, the challenge that Bultmann poses to somebody like Tom Wright is, um, Wright is a historian primarily who really believes that if we get history right, we will get the gospel right. Right, and that's very important to N.T. Wright. This is why he was, you know, uh, the in many ways, crucial to the third quest for the historical Jesus, to the Pauline quest, to kind of get Paul right, and all the other kind of historical quests. Wright really believes that historical research can get us to the truth, and Bultmann doesn't. Bultmann doesn't believe that at all. In fact, I mean, he thinks that that's a deeply arrogant, and here again, ironically, deeply modern position, to use that is that only now, with our tools of historical expertise, can we really finally, once and for all, really hear the message as it was supposed to be heard. For thousands of years, Christians labored in vain, missing the real message of the gospel. And finally, thanks to historians, we've got it right. Like, that's essentially what Wright's whole industry has been. And then Bultmann's saying, no, every age can and has heard the message. We might have tools that were not available to previous generations, but that doesn't give us some sort of unique access to the truth. The truth is beyond world history. It's beyond the world processes. It's an inbreak in reality that inbreaks in every generation, and we're just trying to hear it fresh and authentically for today.
Yeah, and one of the things to even think about that, right, is, and this is true about all four of the theologians looked at in the series, they all had professors they thought were more brilliant than them who legitimated World War One, compromised their critique of bourgeois capitalism on behalf of nationalism, and then sat silent as Nazis came to dominate the theological faculty in Germany, right? And so, in some sense, if you thought being brilliant or capturing history or being the best biblical scholar or whatever somehow made you closer to the existential orientation of one's life after the cross dead Christ, then it just gets falsified when your like favorite teacher's like, but I mean, he's got a point, right? Adolf has a point. Like,
Yep.
and so, and I say that because here's the thing. I've read a lot of emails from people in here. David, a lot of people get this about that context. You know what they don't get it about? Think of how many people said stupid crap after 9/11 and still are driving foreign policy. Think of, like, anyway, I'm not going to go on a long aside. It's almost Christmas Eve. I'm going to go have Christmas party with my family. I'm just thinking, if we thought, like, how many people have just have never recognized that you could be the most like brilliant X, Y, and Z and go like, well, that obviously legitimates the neoliberal economic order, the post-war consensus, and us as an indispensable nation that legitimates X, Y, and Z. And so obviously we should sell arms to Israel. The number of things we could list that on are huge, right? And so when I think of this own moment and all the crises we could be facing, one of the biggest gifts of all four of these theologians, but Bultmann in particular, is this insistence that like every human being finds themselves at some place in the world. And our identity, and we come into our own self-consciousness. We have language and symbols and stories and everything we're in. We didn't pick any of it. It's accidental. And yet in all of those places, he wants to say something quite radical. He's like, odd thing, perk of being made in the image of God. There's actually just no human being or situation where you're anything other than orienting yourself towards the divine. That's the only hindrance from encountering something that liberates you from having your identity inscribed by your narrative of nation or class or race or gender or sexual identity or like, and it just goes through the whole thing. And it's not because those things don't matter. In fact, those are the very places you work out love and care for the neighbor, because the neighbor and the other have the very same value that you do, because the ultimacy shows up for each of them. But if you think some knowledge or some accidental fact of your history or any of that privileges you from the very gift of a God who shows up, and when we talk about it, we talk about a young woman who conceives a child out of wedlock and shepherds find out first. If you think that narrative is the theological narrative for the New Testament, and that secretly means your ethnicity, state, or moment in history privileges you, then you're just idolatrous. And it's okay, because this is the gospel of grace, and I just feel like there's this, like, we're going to be facing so many challenges and questions about what the nature of the church is, and someone who thinks that demythologizing the narratives that claim us, even religious ones, in order to orient us to a radical arrival of God that is potentially present for anyone, is like, that's good news. And it's something worth waiting for, and something worth being disturbed by. And I think too often people in our tribe are like the ones he's harassing in that second sermon, where it's like, you've never even lost sleep about waiting. And what conditions, how bad does it have to get for you to think you can't engineer and reason yourself into salvation? Anyway.
That's a sermon.
Yeah. Wow. You know what? As someone that guest preaches a lot, no one asks you to come on Christmas Eve, David. Like, oh, you want to Zoom preach? Oh, yeah, sure. You want me to come? Yeah, sure. But they're like, no one's like, do you want Christmas Eve? Do you want Easter? No, they don't. They're like, do you want to come on like off days in the summer or green time? Anyway, this has been a lot of fun.
It's been great, and I want to give a shout out to the commenters and the people watching. Great comments and questions. I wish I could get to all of them, but really appreciate that.
Oh yeah. In the book, let's see, there are 2 book questions. I put the Johannes Weiss question is, if people wanted to read Bultmann describing demythologizing, obviously after they bought your Introduction to Bultmann book.
Yep, that's that one there. Yeah, that's mine. If you want to read Bultmann for himself, I mean, besides the letter, the sermons, the book of sermons, which is very good. If you can find it, it's a little hard to. It is available on Internet Archive if you want to read it online. But I really like his. There's a volume of essays. If you want to read his demythologizing material, it's called New Testament Mythology and Other Basic Writings, published by Fortress Press. It's a very good collection of essays. It has the original demythologizing lecture as well as his later writings that kind of help further explain it. His book on Jesus, one of his early books, just called Jesus. It's called Jesus and the Word in English. That's also really good, very readable. That's the closest he gets to kind of historical Jesus work, but he's also reading Jesus in this way that is responsive to the eschatological character of his preaching and the way that Jesus speaks to us today. And if you're really adventurous, the Gospel of John commentary, that's where it's really at. That's his magnum opus.
Oh yeah. All righty. Well, this has been a blast. Thank you so much, David. We should come up with some way of doing some Jungel things. I love God, the Mystery of the World. It's a beautiful book. He reads so many different thinkers in it, and just like the most generative way. And oh, come on. I just think the moment you brought it up, I just started thinking, like, where he talks about, like, most of the world will argue about the essence of God, but it's turned to the existence of God. Oh, come on. God is more than necessary. Oh, that junk a preach. I'm just like,
It's good.
mm.
It's good stuff. No, I'm down for that. Let's do it.
Yeah, I can't. When I think of hermeneutical theology books, it just like get me pumped. It's either that or Ebling's book on faith, because those are like short chapters. You could read that with normal people. No one picks up God, the mystery of the world, and if you don't know what's going on, it's intense. It's intense.
Yep.
Yeah, but anyway, until next time. Now
Thanks
you
a
can
lot,
go tell your
Britt.
friends. Tell your friends. Give me some
Will do.
Jungle for Christmas. Give me some Jungle for Christmas. That's